Tractate Eruvin is largely an entire tractate dedicated to one topic by the laws of Shabbos, which is an expansion on the laws forbidding carrying objects in between domains. It further qualifies prohibitions on certain variations of private property, and what the laws are in areas like alleyways, cul-de-sacs, and similar, and also the laws of the Eruvin, which is a makeshift border around a large enclosure to classify it as an area that is permissible to carry in. The first chapter largely discusses the laws of a Mavoi, which is essentially an alleyway, generally branching into courtyards containing houses. At its entrance to the public property, it needs some sort of a beam or a post or a doorway to create a valid entranceway, so it could be designated for this purpose. So, the first Mishnah begins. If, at the entrance to the Mavoi-Alley, there's a crossbeam over it as the entranceway, it must be lower than 20 cubits off the ground. Rabbi Yehuda says it's fine if it's over 20 cubits. If the entranceway is wider than 10 cubits, you must decrease it so it's smaller, unless the entrance has a door frame, which is 2 posts and a crossbeam, in which case it can be wider than 10 cubits. The Gemara says that it explains how to rectify it when it's over 20 cubits, unlike by the discussion on a sukkah, as that's a biblical law, while this is rabbinic. Alternatively, it's actually allowed to rectify both. It's just that by a sukkah, where we don't give an explanation as to how to rectify it, those laws are just a lot more complicated, so they just said it's not allowed and left it at that. The dispute between the opinions here, one which says that it can't be over 20 cubits and the other one which says that it can, is based on whether we're learning this from the entranceway of the sanctuary of the tabernacle, which was 20 cubits high, or from the antechamber, which was a lot higher. The sources are explained, of which there are variants, and the exact wording is argued on a bit. We try to ask why we don't learn it from some other source, but they're disproven. The logic is questioned based on the measurement of the structures, and which ones are referenced as a proper entranceway. We also say we need this very similar law, according to an opinion that they're the same, established both by the laws of sukkahs and this mavoi beam, as a sukkah is dwelled in, and the top is looked at, versus this, which nobody's really inspecting the height of the beam, so it's necessary for this opinion to repeat this opinion, allowing both when they're over 20 cubits. There are similar points discussed. It also brings up the case of what if the crossbeam is partially within 20 cubits and partially above, and what about by the top of the sukkah? One opinion rules that it's permissible by a mavoi and not allowed by a sukkah. We try to bring some explanations to this logic, and we say it's because a sukkah is used by a private individual, so if the top shifts so that way it's no longer permissible, he probably won't notice, versus by a mavoi, which is public use, so people will notice its condition. Some say it's not allowed by a sukkah, which is a biblical law, but allowed by a mavoi, which is only rabbinic. Some teach this entire argument in the exact inverse. A sukkah would be allowed, as it's for individual use, so you're mindful and responsible of it, versus a mavoi, which would not be allowed in this situation, as it's public use, so everybody would just expect somebody else to take care of its condition. And the other point was that a sukkah is biblical, so people would actually be more careful by it, versus a mavoi, which is only rabbinic, so it needs safeguards to disallow it in this situation. Some just allow neither, some allow both. They both bring respective proofs. Now, all this while, we've been using the measurement of an amma, a cubit, or an arm's breadth. In modern measurement, it's somewhere between roughly 1.5 feet, possibly more. The point posed here is, how big exactly is a cubit? Is it 5 handbreadths, or is it 6? There's some argument as to which of these two measurements are applied by this conversation, whether it's the longer or the shorter variant. Some say we do use the shorter variant by the laws of a sukkah by certain measurements like its maximum height and similar, although there is disagreement. There is an opinion that we use the stringent option by the laws of kilayim, forbidden plant mixtures, by measuring the clearing and perimeter of a vineyard. There are a number of opinions brought as to what the distances need to be, but they use the longer version of the measurement. There is disagreement based on disproofs regarding the measurements. Some say that we always use the 6 handbreadth measurement of a cubit, but by the laws of kilayim, you make a loose, larger fist, as it's stricter when larger, and by sukkah and a mavoi, the measurements are made with a clenched fist, so they're a bit smaller, as these are stricter when they're smaller. We try to bring some proofs and disproofs for these two opinions. Some say, in regards to the laws of kilayim, that they should be measured with 6 handbreadths, which implies that sukkah and mavoi should be measured with 5, like the first opinion, but perhaps not. Perhaps he intended to exclude the cubit measurements by the temple altar, some of which use the 5-cubit variation. Some say the laws of measurement, standards, interposition, in a mikvah, and partitions are a tradition passed down from Mount Sinai. We try to bring a biblical source for the laws of measures being referenced in the 7 fruits of Israel, which each reference a form of measurement, which was a concept mentioned back in Tractate Brachos, but we say no, the laws are orally passed traditions with biblical verses as source. We also try to bring a biblical source for the laws of interpositions, so we say that the oral tradition was to teach that interpositions in your hair, like knots or similar, can invalidate an immersion, but actually no, we bring a biblical source for that too, so rather the oral law is that an interposition that covers a majority of your hair, but you're fine with it being there, still counts as an interposition. We're fine in that situation with an interposition by a minor part of your hair, by the way. We have the same question again, bringing an apparent biblical source for the law of partitions. So we say that we needed an oral teaching, maybe to show that the tabernacle structure used cubit units of 6 handbreadths, while the tabernacle vessels used cubit units of 5 handbreadths, according to the opinion that holds that everything in the tabernacle used the standard cubit unit of 6 handbreadths. The oral tradition was to teach a few miscellaneous laws, that you can extend a wall up or down, the law of lavud, which allows us to view small gaps in a wall as closed, and the law of a bent wall of a sukkah, where a portion of the wall extends upward to be part of the roof. Okay, back to the crossbeam over a mavoi. If it's too high, you can pile earth on the ground to make it less than a 20-cubit gap. Some say its width of the dirt pile must be a handbreadth. Some say 4 handbreadths. We offer some suggestions as to the basis of this dispute, and it's either that the first opinion requires the crossbeam as a reminder, so that's where the public domain ends, so you just need a handbreadth of ground raised, versus the other opinion, who requires 4 handbreadths, as he holds it's to serve as an actual partition. Alternatively, you could just say that they both hold it's required as a reminder, but they're arguing over if the dimensions of the reminder by the ground needs to be bigger or the same size as the beam above. Or, alternatively, they agree that it could just be the same size as the beam, it's just that one requires it to be bigger out of concern that the ground will erode. Okay, same concern but the inverse. What if the crossbeam is too low, being under 10 handbreadths? You'd need to excavate dirt underneath to make the gap over 10 handbreadths. But some say it needs to be 4 handbreadths wide, while others say it must be 4 cubits wide. Again, they both give logics, and they both rule in accordance with the other opinions of raising the mound. We discussed the comparison to a case of a mavoi with a breached wall right beside the entranceway, in which opinions agree or disagree with that based on where the board is and how large the breach is. It similarly discusses some measurements of a side post. There's more on this topic. There's further points on cases of the location of the breach. If it's on the front, it can be up to 4 handbreadths. If it's on the side, it can be up to 10 cubits. As it's not viewed as a gap, it's just viewed as another entrance. If the corner itself is included in the breach, as long as the breach is over 4 handbreadths, it would actually invalidate this enclosure, as it's not viewed as an entrance here, as people don't put entrances in the corners of their walls, usually. Others disagree on this point. It discusses some other variation, what if there are ridges in the breach, how that makes variance, and similar. It also brings up turning a street into a manner permissible to be carried in. If there's houses on either side, you make a door frame on one end and a crossbeam or post on the other. Others say it's a debate. One says you put a door on either end and you have to have the doors closed when traveling through, while another opinion says you can put a door on one side and a post or crossbeam on the other. This is argued further. It says that the city of Jerusalem and Mechozah have doors which are shut, so that way you're not liable for carrying inside. So, rather, some say it means you need a door frame on one end, while others say that it needs a proper door, and there are some opinions who rule like this. Some say you don't need to close the door. We try to bring a proof to the gates of the city of Nehardia, which were sunk into the sand and stuck open, but we can't as they are partially closed actually. One sage said that they should clear the sand, but that may have been only to make the doors fit to be closed. This and further points on doors are questioned. Who we follow gets into an argument about following contradicting stringencies, such as by an argument regarding an incomplete skeleton, if it has laws of impurity, the argument being how many vertebrae can be missing, and what the damage to the skull needs to be, and similar points on tithes. There's further debate on the case. Some say it's where the mavoi opens into a public domain on one end, and an open field onto the other. You just need a door frame and a post. Some say if one end opens into a public domain and the other end opens into a back lot, you only need one post by the front. We try to bring comparison to a case of a mavoi that opens into a courtyard, that the far end of the courtyard opposite the mavoi is breached. It says you can carry in the courtyard but not in the mavoi. Some say it varies in this case if there was an Eruv boundary made over the mavoi and courtyard together. We also argue what can separate the courtyard and the mavoi, arguing on a post that's visible from the outside but flush on the inside, and if the courtyard ends in the middle or at the side of the back lot. This is argued on further, and we have a few opinions who hold differently on the topic. Some qualify this saying it's allowed if the backlot breach is not directly across from the mavoi, and it's only forbidden to carry in the mavoi if it's directly across. Some even add the qualification that you can only carry in a mavoi opposite a breached wall that's not perfectly aligned if the lot is owned by many people. As if it's owned by one person, it's possible, occasionally this happens, that people will build houses in their back lot, which would then make your mavoi essentially a mavoi which ends at the side of a back lot, which you can't carry within. We try to bring the source by a case of a mavoi where one side is a sea and the other side is a trash heap, but that doesn't have a ruling, as on one hand, those are valid partitions, but on the other hand, the trash heap could be removed and the sea might bring up sediment, which would make the sea no longer steep enough to be a wall. Anyways, point is of bringing this case was that the concern by the trash heap was by a private owner who could remove it at any time. So based on this, we see there is a difference by a mavoi owned by many or by a single individual. By the trash and sea case, we rule that you can't carry there. One sage put up extra nets by a city as partitions as they were using the sea, which he was concerned about bringing up sediment. There are other cases discussed. We also say that a small courtyard that was breached into a large one, you can carry in the large, but not the small, as it's like an entrance to the large courtyard. There are other such cases brought up. It also brings up a mavoi with many branching off mavois. Some say it needs posts at their ends, but where the mavois meet each other, you need a doorway, so it fits like the other opinions. It also discusses a mavoi whose walls are slightly disaligned. If the gap is less than 4 cubits, you can put a crossbeam diagonally across the edges. If it's longer, it starts at the shorter wall. Others say you always need to put the beam across the shorter wall, and the diagonal beam won't serve as a reminder, which he holds is its function. The one who allows it, he holds that it serves as a partition, which it does if diagonal. Some limit the diagonal beam to being 10 cubits or shorter, and if longer, you have to place it across the short end. Also, the argument if the beam is as a partition or a reminder would also cause an argument if you can carry directly beneath the beam. Alternatively, it could be that there is an argument even if they agree that the beam is to serve as a reminder, as it's about whether it's a reminder for the outside or the inside. Or they could agree that it's to serve as a partition, and they argue if the outer or inner edge creates the partition. There's also an argument if you stick 2 pegs on the outside of the walls and put the beam on those, whether that's a valid crossbeam beam for a mavoi. Some say it depends on if you hold you can carry under a beam. Some say it's not allowed at all, as the beam needs to be on top of the mavoi. If there's a crossbeam suspended on a vertical beam in front of a mavoi, some say it's allowed to be less than 3 cubits away from the mavoi walls. Some say 4. So that seemingly contradicts the prior point, so we say no, that's not what that case refers to. Actually what it means is either where the beam is only over one wall, or in between the 2 walls over 2 pegs, and it's allowed due to some leniencies. There's further argument on carrying beneath a crossbeam, and also whether you can carry opposite a post, which is also argued based on sources. Some say the argument is where there's a series of posts lined up with less than 4 cubit spaces, based on whether you hold this applies to gaps less than 3 or 4 spaces, and their respective logics, whether they're included in one region or not. This is argued on further with different qualifications. We try to suggest a case of just one post that's visible, but flush with the wall of the mavoi, but it's held that that isn't valid. It's actually argued on, and some hold a post that's visible from the inside and flush with the outside is a valid post. We're trying to figure out who holds which. We also try to bring the case of a mavoi wall that's indented. If it results in a post flush on the outside and visible on the inside, or vice versa, it's valid. We conclude that it's a Rabbi Chia that holds a post only visible from the outside is valid, and Rabbi Shimon ben Rebbe says it's not. We argue the cases further. We bring back the case of the 2 courtyards, one bigger than the other, extending into each other. We say if the small courtyard's walls extend into the larger one and forms 3 cubit gaps, those should be valid as posts, maybe? So we say no, it's unevenly slotted in, so one side is 4 cubits wide and the other is 2, so only one side is a post, and this is like the opinion that requires 2 side posts. We discuss the cases further and bring proof that a post visible only from the outside and flush on the inside is a valid post. Others disagree and say that if the post is flush and extends in a line along with the mavoi, if it's less than 4 cubits long, it's valid, and you can carry until the post's inner edge. If it's longer than 4 cubits, it's just considered to be an extension of the wall and cannot be used as a post. Based on this, it would imply that a post visible on the outside and flush on the inside is a valid post, and we say in the end that that's the ruling, that it's a valid post. The next point was on a mavoi wider than 10 cubits, you need to decrease it. The opinions on this are discussed. Some allow sticking a pole between a 20 cubit mavoi to separate it. Others disagree and require sticking a 10 by 4 cubit board in between the length of the mavoi. Some allow, by a 15 cubit wide mavoi, to put a 10 by 3 board along the width, leaving a gap of 2 and 10 cubits. We also discussed why we didn't suggest 2 1.5 boards or 3 1 cubit boards, which would imply that the gaps can't be equal to the size of the walls, but we say that's not why, it's because the middle board gets nullified by the gaps on its sides. Also, the reason we didn't suggest a cubit gap next to the wall and between 2 1.5 boards separated by a cubit is as we didn't want to trouble people to have to make 2 boards. This is discussed further along with comparison to a case of a leather cover on a latrine seat and its measurements and gaps. We also said that a too wide mavoi can be fixed by putting in a door frame, and a too tall mavoi can be fixed with a prominent, noticeable, extended crossbeam. As for the inverse, a door frame is valid for fixing a too high mavoi, but we don't have a proof that a prominent crossbeam fixes a too wide mavoi. Others hold that a door frame is not valid to fix a too wide mavoi. Based on that logic, if there's a courtyard surrounded by walls that have doorways and window frames, those are considered like door frames, and it's invalid to carry within, based on the logic that the gaps in the wall are wider than the wall segments, and it cannot be corrected by a door frame. But we say that's not a good comparison, as the gaps in the walls of a courtyard are a less serious breach than a too wide mavoi, so they're not comparable. We try to bring another proof, but again, that one deals with something unique, which is a defective entranceway, either without side posts or a top, so again, not comparable. We argue further as to which proofs hold that a too wide mavoi is invalid. We also try to bring a comparison to a case of a vine stretched across poles, which is discussed for a bit. In regards to the making of a door frame, it must have the top beam on top of its posts, not on their sides, and it must be strong enough to hold a door, even if it's one made of straw. Some even require it to have a hinge of a sort as a pivot hole. Some require the top beam to be touching the posts, others don't require it. There's a quick story about this. There's also a connected argument if you put a mezuzah on an archway. Some say yes, some say no. There's argument on the dimensions of the size, and the argument is based on whether we hold you can carve to complete the necessary definitions. It's argued further. New Mishnah. If you want to make a mavoi allowed to be carried inside, Beis Shammai requires a beam and a post, Beis Hillel requires a beam or a post. Some require 2 beams. Some say that they actually agree that you can do either or if it's less than 4 cubits wide, and the argument is by a mavoi that's 4 to 10 cubits. Beis Shammai requiring both, and Beis Hillel requiring either. Some say that they argue in both cases. The Gemara says that this argument refers to a closed mavoi, meaning with 3 walls. We say that Beis Shammai requires the 4 walls rabbinically, and Beis Hillel requires 3 walls and a partition rabbinically. When the third opinion says that he required 2 posts, we try to conclude from a source whether he also needs a crossbeam, but we can't. There's further points, and whether we're more lenient by narrower alleys, less than 4 cubits. There's also argument if you need 1 or 2 boards by the entrance to a courtyard to allow it. We also bring a case of a courtyard that ends at the sea that only requires 1 board, but that's because there's leniencies by a body of water. There are more discussions on this topic. It also gets into a sea that breaches the middle of a courtyard, and we say that if the gap is 10 cubits or less, then you can draw water from it, but if more, then not. In this case, you can still carry in the courtyard, as the case is where there's still the bottom half of the wall 10 cubits high beneath the water. Some say that a mavoi with a beam, you can't throw things into it, but with a post you can. This is discussed further, whether you can make a shittuf, which is where you merge courtyards by everybody contributing some bread that's then placed into a common location in one of the courtyards to designate people to be allowed to carry between them. So it's argued if that makes a difference and how. The argument by the post and beam is that this opinion says that a post is a partition and a beam is a reminder, but others say both are reminders. These points are argued on further, along with an attempted comparison to a case of 2 houses on opposite sides of a public property. You can either put 2 posts on either end of one of the houses or 2 beams, and that makes it a private property in between. Others say we can't. The reason that person allowed it, however, was because he held that that was sufficient to make the area a biblical private property. These points are argued on further, along with more discussion on specific distances. It also talks about some sages who learned underneath others and would write scrolls with ink of a specific sort with great precision. This is discussed further, along with some points on the Saita ceremony. This also discusses some laws of ritual impurity. It also says that for 3 years, the 2 big schools, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, debated each other on laws, until eventually a voice came down from heaven which said that both of the reviews are the words of God, but we in practice follow Beis Hillel. The reason is explained that in Beis Hillel, they would study also Beis Shammai's laws, and in fact, say them first, and were very humble. We can learn from this that somebody who lowers themselves, God raises, and somebody who raises themselves up, God lowers. Whoever searches for prominence, prominence flees from him, and whoever flees from prominence, it chases after him. The same applies by similar concepts. It expounds more on points between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. New Mishnah. The width of the crossbeam must be at least a handbreadth, as it needs to be able to hold a half brick, at least width-wise, and a brick is 3 handbreadths. Some also require it to be strong enough to hold the half brick, others don't, meaning it could be made of straw, or it could be bent, or round. Also, if a round object has a circumference of 3 handbreadths, it has the width of a cubit. Technically, the beam needs a handbreadth and a half, but we can cement underneath the brick to fill it in. There's an argument if the supports of the beam also need to be strong enough to hold the brick. Also, if you drape a mat over the beam that doesn't extend to 3 handbreadths to the ground, it's no longer valid as it's covered, so it can't serve as a reminder, and it's not a good partition as kid goats can pass underneath the gap. It also discussed the validity of several unusual variants of the crossbeams, such as 2 narrow beams that can hold a brick across them, and what level we view it if one thin beam is higher and one is lower. Also, some hold that if it's over 4 handbreadths wide, it's valid even if it's not strong enough to hold a half brick. The remaining points are expanded on and what they teach us. It also gets into a discussion on the mikvah pools made by King Solomon and their sizes and measurements. New Mishnah. The posts. Their height must be 10 handbreadths, and some say their width and thickness can be any amount. Some say the width must be 3 handbreadths. The Gemara says that it's talking about posts in general, not like either opinion. Any amount means even as thin as a string. There are some other cases discussed, and we mention an opinion that if the post is 3 handbreadths off the ground or to the side of a wall, it's invalid. It's further discussed along with a point on making brine on Shabbos, whose opinion we follow, but one sage said that we rule like the accepted practice, which everybody does, which is to use posts of any width. If a post was in the proper place of a mavoi, but it wasn't placed there for that purpose, it's not valid. But there's an argument if it's valid if you intended that it should be a mavoi post before Shabbos started, the argument being whether its initial construction required the proper intent or if this is sufficient. The same argument exists by a partition and similar points by a sukkah, and we try to bring a number of proofs for this argument. We bring a number of them, but in the end we show that it's valid to designate it as a mavoi post right before Shabbos. New Mishnah. You can make a post out of anything, and there's an argument if you can use a live animal. Also, a living thing transmits impurity the same way a tomb cover does. Others disagree. There's also an argument if you can write a bill of divorce on a living thing. The Gemara says that the opinion that you can't write a divorce document on a living thing is based on the verse which specifies on a parchment document. This is argued on further along with other opinions. New Mishnah. If a caravan camped in an open field and they surrounded their encampment with animal accessories like saddles and whatnot, they can carry within on Shabbos if the barrier is 10 handbreadths high and the width of the gaps are less than the solid parts. If there's a large gap that's 10 cubits wide or less, it's fine. It's just regarded as the entrance. If it's more, it's not allowed. The Gemara has a disagreement over if the gaps in the wall are equal in size to their solid parts. There's further argument along with if you enlarge the gaps and by a sukkah. These points and similar are all discussed at length. This and points on gaps go on for a bit. New Mishnah. By this caravan, they can also surround it with 3 ropes if they aren't 3 cubits apart, and the rope's combined thickness must be over a handbreadth, so this way this gate is at least technically 10 handbreadths. They can also have a series of vertical poles, as long as they aren't 3 handbreadths apart. Some say this only applies by a caravan, others say it applies by anybody, it just give caravans as the common example. Some say the partitions require both of these, others say only one. The Gemara tries to bring a proof that the vertical poles, if there's gaps, it's invalidated just like by the horizontal ones, but we can't, and there are a few points on this. There are further points on how much space an individual gets and how many are considered a caravan, it's all argued on. The other points are discussed, and then it says that the difference between the views, if we need both the vertical and horizontal portions or just one, is in a case where it's in an inhabited area. New Mishnah, there are 4 things that are permitted in an army camp. They can carry wood from any place, they don't need to wash their hands before a meal, they can eat demai, which is questionably tithed produce, and they're exempt from making an Eruv boundary. The Gemara specifies which types of wood they can take. It also says that where a soldier is killed, that's where he's buried, as he's considered an unattended corpse, which is buried where it's found, even if he has people who would bury him. This is discussed further. The washing that they're exempt from is washing before a meal, not after, as there's sodomite salt that can leave traces on your hands and it could cause blindness if you don't wash it off. Also, you should definitely wash your hands after handling large amounts of salt. We expand the points on eating demai, and the points of an eruv are in regards to an eruv chatzeros, allowing you to carry between private domains, but they must abide by the laws of eruv techumen, the 2,000 cubit limit of travel on Shabbos. It also discusses the punishments for violating this, and that's the end of chapter 1.